All right, we have people starting to come into the room. Thank you for joining us. We will be getting started in just a couple of moments. Give this, I don't know, 30 seconds for people to join us on this beautiful Friday afternoon here in Washington, D.C. All right, so I think we're going to get started. For folks who join us late, they can watch the brilliant introductions online. Good morning and welcome. I'm Laura Friedman. Welcome to the 8th and final session of the Congressional Teach-In, hosted by the Foundation for Middle East Peace and the Middle East Institute. This series is entitled Israel, Palestine, Where We Are, What Comes Next, and Why It Matters to Congress. As I said, I'm Laura Friedman, President of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this series with Khaled El-Gindi, Director of the Program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute.
Thanks, Laura. So today's session is going to be on Palestinian politics and governance. And so there's quite a lot to talk about. To help us dig into these issues, we've assembled another really excellent panel of experts. I'll introduce them here briefly in alphabetical order. First, we have Sam Bahour, an independent Palestinian-American political analyst and businessman based in Ramallah. Sam is currently an independent director at the Arab Islamic Bank and an advisory board member of the Open Society Foundation's MENA office. He is co-founder and board chair of Americans for a Vibrant Palestinian Economy, a board member of Just Vision, and a policy advisor at a Shabaka Policy Network. Second, we're thrilled to have Dana Al-Kurd. Dana is a researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, as well as an assistant professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. She specializes in comparative politics and international relations and is the author of an excellent book called Polarized and Demobilized: Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine, which came out 2 years ago. And third, we have Omar Rahman. Omar is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center, where he is writing a book on Palestinian fragmentation in the post-Oslo era. Prior to joining Brookings, Omar was a research analyst at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, where he focused on geopolitics of reconstruction in Yemen, Arab Gulf foreign policy in the Horn of Africa, and the political economy of the Gulf region. You can read their full bios on the FMEP website, the landing page for this series. Our colleagues will put a link in the chat box, and also keep an eye on the chat box, which is where we're going to be putting the panelists' Twitter handles and any relevant articles that they may have written on the subjects that we're going to be talking about. Anything that you may have missed, don't worry, it'll all be posted after the event on the landing page for this series.
Great, and the format for this teach-in, and for anyone who's been with us for the previous 7 sessions, you know this, it will be moderated as a Q&A by Khaled and myself. We have some basic questions to get things started. We welcome questions from the audience, which again, this is an event that is for congressional staff. Feel free to submit them at any time through the Q&A box. We will try to use as many of your questions as we can, and we'll of course share them with our panelists so they will get an understanding of what things you are looking to understand. And if you have any technical problems, please put a note into the chat box and we will get to those. Our colleagues will be watching that. And with that, let's begin. Back to you, Khaled.
Thanks, Laura. So just by way of setup here, Palestinian politics and governance are idiosyncratic in a lot of ways. For example, in the sense that they operate under this broader context of Israeli occupation, but also we have this kind of duality of political institutions or a political address in the form of the PLO on the one hand, and also the Palestinian Authority. The PLO, of course, was created in 1964, and the Palestinian Authority came about as a result of the Oslo process in 1994. So I'm going to ask Omar to start us off with, start us off with the basics. What are the issues and themes that animate Palestinian politics that may be different from politics in other contexts? For example, how does the Israeli occupation or the fact that as many Palestinians live in refugee camps in neighboring countries as do live in the occupied territories, how do these things shape Palestinian politics? Also, since people often confuse the PLO and the PA or use them interchangeably, tell us about why there are these two institutions. What is the relationship to one another? Are they both equally relevant? And just sort of give us a kind of lay of the land of the basics of Palestinian politics.
Thank you, Khaled, and thank you, Laura, first for inviting me, and to FMEP and MEI for what is really a great series. This is obviously, it's the basics. It's a big question. I mean, I think I could spend an hour at least discussing it. But I think it's worth saying, first of all, that Palestinian politics today, as you said, Khaled, is extremely complex. It's convoluted. There are layers of institutions operating simultaneously with no real clear boundaries or mandates, and they're doing so, as you also mentioned, under a half-century-old military occupation, and within what was essentially, or has essentially been, an aborted political framework, the Oslo framework. So let me start off really by saying that, on the question of what animates Palestinian politics, I don't think, I mean, to my own understanding, to my own knowledge, there's any national group like the Palestinians in terms of this large stateless population. And if you compare them to, let's say, the Kurds, which are also a national group, a large national group spread across multiple countries in the Middle East, I think what differentiates the Palestinians from the Kurds, let's say, is that the Kurds in Iraq, in Turkey, in Syria, in Iran, are citizens of that state, whereas Palestinians are stateless. Most Palestinians, for the most part, are stateless. And that's a central animating theme of Palestinian politics, not just in the sense of not having a state, like the Kurds don't have a state, but what's derived from a state, which is essentially rights, because it's not just the right to self-determination, but basic fundamental rights. In our international system, although we speak of natural rights, of inalienable rights, it is a state that essentially delivers rights to its citizens, and the Palestinians lack that state. And I think that's what sets them apart, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. And if you'll permit me, I think it requires a little bit of history to understand how Palestinian politics came to be the way it is today, how those institutions formed, and how we've gotten kind of the situation that we're in. So if you'll permit me, I know it's we're trying to make it tight on time, but I'll just try to cover a lot of ground quickly. Obviously 1948 is extremely important in understanding that the destruction of Palestinian society on its native lands in 1948 led to the expulsion of Palestinians. 2/3 to around 3/4 of the population was spread out, both in what became the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, but also in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, and elsewhere. And so Palestinian politics deals with an essential dispersal and fragmentation across different states, and are dealing with different contexts. And therefore, these fragmented communities of Palestinians are essentially dealing with different lived experiences, different priorities, and different interests. So the Palestinians that are in the refugee camps, obviously their biggest priority is to return home. And so the right of return essentially encapsulates a driving principle for Palestinians. And that really animated Palestinian political life, because it emerged in exile after 1948. Whereas Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, although there are plenty of refugees there as well, their primary motivating factor is to end the occupation of Israel, which has gone on for 50+ years. And then there's Palestinians that are citizens of Israel, 20% of Israel's population, who have had a very different experience. And although they are enfranchised members of the state of Israel today, maybe not equal, but their lived experience is much different, because Israel sought to denationalize them as Palestinians. And so they essentially just became Arabs, denationalized Arabs. And if they were nationalized in any way, it was as Israeli Arabs. But if you know anything about Israel, Israeli is not a nationality within Israel. There's the, it's the nation state of the Jewish people. There's a Jewish nationality, but not Israeli nationality. And that's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. So this Palestinian group is quite different. And what animates them is for Israel to become a state equal for all its citizens. So anyway, after 1948, as Palestinians were regrouping in exile, they started to form different factions and different groups. And the Arab states perceived this, the growing radicalization of Palestinian groups, as a threat. And so it created the PLO in 1964 as kind of a organizing framework to organize all these different groups under one umbrella that they thought they could control. And they did control it. And not everybody joined the PLO. In fact, Fatah, which is the largest and most important Palestinian political faction over time, initially refused to join the PLO until after 1967, the war, the defeat of the Arab states, and essentially the discrediting of the Arab states. Then Fatah joined. It managed to wrest control of the PLO away from the Arab states and was recognized in 1974 as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. And that, essentially it became the supreme body, the supreme representative of Palestinians, and it holds that title at least today, even though things have changed dramatically. And it's the agent of the national agenda of the Palestinians, which has evolved over time, and we can get into that. Anyway, flash forward, a big history, there's a lot to cover there, but flash forward to 1993, as you mentioned, Khaled, the PLO signs the Oslo Accords with Israel. They established the PA, which was essentially just designed to be a provisional entity for the duration of negotiations, which wasn't supposed to last more than 5 years until 1999. And so, it started in that context, but essentially, as the peace process faded away, and there is no peace process really anymore, the PA has continued to exist for over 25 years, detached from the political process that brought it into existence. And so over time, that's had a huge impact, and I think we'll get into that, but it's had a huge impact on the status of the PA, the relationship of it to the PLO, which was supposed to be subordinate, but eventually all the energy and the funding flowed into the PA. The international community was more interested in the PA than in the PLO, and the Palestinians saw it again as their kind of proto-state entity and invested themselves in it and marginalized the PLO. The PLO was essentially cut off. It deteriorated. It was cut off from the larger Palestinian diaspora, the refugee communities, and all that kind of stuff. And so those people essentially lost their voice in the Palestinian political center, and things have kind of evolved around the PA. The other thing I'll just mention that's important for the Palestinians in terms of their politics. Well, there's also an insider-outsider issue that I think we could discuss in terms of the relationship between Palestinians outside in the diaspora and inside as they've lost their voice. But there's also the relationship of the PA to Israel. And obviously Israel was the enemy of the Palestinian Liberation Organization for a long time, but after 1993 and in the Oslo Accords, it became the partner. Yet at the same time, it was still occupying the Palestinians militarily. And so this created a very confusing dynamic, which they thought would be resolved over the period of those 5 years, but was not. And sorry, I just got something pop up on my screen. It was not. And so the Palestinians are both a partner of Israel in terms of security cooperation and all these kind of things, but at the same time, Israel continues to occupy them, to dominate their lives, to continue to build settlements and undermine the ultimate project. And so it's created this very big dilemma. And the Palestinian leadership, I'll end with this, has been unable to address, essentially, it's grown into a greater amount of dysfunction. It's unable to address the challenges that face Palestinian society. And the most important thing is that as a Palestinian state, which was the raison d'etre for creating the Palestinian Authority, has become ever more remote. They don't know, there's the realization that that independent state may be forever out of reach. And so where do they go from here? What do they do with the state building project that has consumed so much energy and so many resources and taken over 20 years? And how do they revitalize and reorient their national movement? And I think that's the kind of stage where Palestinian politics is today. And I can leave it there. I can address a couple more issues if you want me to, in terms of the leadership of the PA and the PLO and how they've kind of become confused.
So I think we can come back to some of that. That's an amazing laying groundwork for the rest of this conversation. I really appreciate it. I want to come to Sam. And, Omar talked about the various, the difference in the PA and the PLO and how this has evolved and the diaspora versus the different interests. Another piece of this is the division amongst Palestinians who are in Palestine. So you and Omar differentiate between Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and those who are not. There's also the political and geographic division of Palestinians, particularly didn't start with the 2007 war. Israel's effort to sort of bifurcate the Palestinian polity between the West Bank and Gaza began before that, but really cemented after the 2007 civil war, Palestinian civil war effectively, where Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip and left the PA to operate in the West Bank. At the same time, since then, we've seen literally dozens of reconciliation deals, or a dozen or so reconciliation deals over the past decade, most recently last September, following the Arab normalization agreements with Israel. Can you talk about how that internal division has affected Palestinian institutional politics and what you think are the prospects for reconciliation this time around? And we're going to talk about elections later on in this webinar, but I mean, if you want to sort of hint at that as well, it's not unrelated, obviously.
Sure, thank you. And I want to thank FMEP and MEI for the opportunity. Again, I think this is an amazing series, very, very well timed as well. I want to reinforce that historical fact that the Palestinians have been geographically divided ever since 1948, when the State of Israel was established and resulted in the first mass displacement of Palestinians. We're not only talking about the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but we're talking about all the different parts of the occupied territory and the rest of our people that are not able to access us because of the Israeli military stopping their ability to enter Palestine. And yes, true, we in the West Bank and Gaza have had two separate governing bodies since 2007. But we must always remember that both of them are under the ultimate beck and call of Israel, which is the military occupier of both. So where you called it civil war, I would call it a jailhouse riot between the prisoners of who's going to control what kind of resource that the prison has within it. And that's more like what happened with Hamas and Fatah, because ultimately the jailer never went anywhere. The jailer is the State of Israel. That noted, the two largest political blocs, Fatah and Hamas, have made several attempts to reconcile their differences over time, but the issues between them are deep and polarized to the point of having two very different worldviews that will not find common ground easily. Although a different example, think Democrats and the Republicans who instigated the January 6th insurrection. Not much in common. The only thing that carried the day on October 6th, on January 6th, was a 245-year system of democracy with all of its faults. That's something the Palestinians have not yet embarked on because we've been facing this military occupation for 53 years. The result of this internal division has created a reality that needs very extraordinary efforts to repair, be it a dual judiciary system that has been adjudicating over the last 15 years in two different environments. And there's facts on the ground that get created because of those different sets of decisions by the courts. Also, you have laws that have been passed via decrees in both areas, which mean that there's two different legal systems within the Palestinian community, and that's above and beyond Israeli military orders, remnants of Jordanian law, remnants of Turkish law. So the legal system is a mess. And I'll get to that when we talk about elections as well, because they're related. What we must realize here is that the externalities are making any mending of the Palestinian political system almost impossible, starting with the Israeli military pressure, such as the decades-long closure of Gaza, the never-ending settlement expansion, which, by the way, continued as Biden came to office, just as it did when he was here visiting as vice president under Obama. So these externalities, whether it's the Israeli side or the American side, are instigating to make sure that we don't have the opportunity to mend or even start to mend our political system. What will be required moving forward is bold leadership, starting with the Palestinians, but also US leadership on the issue as well. And that can only come from America's executive branch, given the legislative branch in the US may be under the same Israeli military occupation that we are here in Palestine. They may not have the ability to be able to legislate in terms of what's in America's strategic interest because of the heavy-handed Israeli lobby that kind of defines what happens in Congress as it relates to Palestine and Israel. So that would be the reality of this division that we're seeing and a little bit about the context of it.
Thanks, Sam. I think it's a good segue to the questions I want to put to Dana. So we talked about Palestinian fragmentation, political division, and even when we're looking just at the situation in the occupied territories, obviously, one of the key, but certainly not the only Palestinian constituency, but even just looking at the occupied territories, we have an array of different sort of systems of governance, all kind of within the envelope of Israeli occupation. You've got, Gaza is under Hamas control, at least within the border fence of the Gaza Strip. You have, Area A and to some extent Area B in the West Bank, where, Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority operates. And then you have Palestinians in Jerusalem who are not citizens of Israel, but who are governed by Israel in a sort of kind of political and administrative limbo. So give us, how does that fragmentation play out in practical terms for Palestinians?
Thanks so much, Khaled. I hope I caught your question. It cut off a little bit for me at the end. So if I missed something, please, feel free to let me know. Thank you also to my co-panelists for a very thorough summarization of some of these issues. So just to reiterate on what Sam and Omar have already said, the fragmentation obviously preceded the Oslo Accords, but I would say that the Oslo Accords, particularly in the territories and in historic Palestine, has exacerbated a lot of both the geographical and political fragmentation that we saw. So the Oslo Accords, like you mentioned, divided the West Bank specifically into Area A, B, and C. So today, the Palestinian Authority is only allowed to function in certain parts of these areas. Again, the idea was statehood by 1999, but this never materialized. So they remain kind of only partially in control of these territories. Today, most Palestinians, 55% of the population, live in Area A, which is mostly urban, although it only contains 18% of the territory. And then Palestinian cities are split off from each other. So even between Palestinian areas, there are Israeli checkpoints and settlements and complete Israeli control over movement. Comparatively, 41% of Palestinians live in Area B. So this is kind of, mix of rural and urban, and this is about 20% of the territory. And approximately 1% of Palestinians live in Area C, and that's 62% of the West Bank territory. So the Palestinians in Area C often find themselves in what Israel has declared security zones or closed security zones, military zones after 1967. So they're constantly facing threats of demolition and harassment and an inability to remain on their land. So we see that with the Khirbat Hamsa and like a lot of these, villages that come into the media spotlight from time to time. Now, Palestinians in Area B are also living quite precariously because they exist on some of these flashpoints, so to speak. So they're often very close to settlements, and they deal with land theft as a result of the expansion of these settlements. Some of them are very close to the segregation wall. So, like I said, many villages have had their land seized by growing settlements, and they've attempted to protest and organize against these activities, but their opposition to ongoing land thefts make them a target, and there's been a lot of political repression in these areas as well. So, like I said, the Palestinian Authority is allowed to function, let's say, most fully in Area A, and they have to kind of share coordination with the Israeli occupation forces and leave certain areas in Area B, and they're not allowed at all to function in Area C. So Palestinians across the West Bank are not allowed to travel freely from even within the West Bank itself. They have to apply for permission to travel abroad, and they can't visit Jerusalem or Gaza. And they're subject, across the three areas, they're subject to Israeli incursions and settler violence. And so the Palestinian Authority, to kind of prove themselves a worthy partner to the Israelis in these areas, often acts as a subcontractor of repression for the Israeli occupation. They basically make sure to silence dissent so that Palestinians don't mobilize or threaten the occupation as they have done in the past. And this dynamic has been exacerbated after 2006, and I can talk more about that in some of the coming questions. So Jerusalem was considered outside the scope of this whole scheme. The Palestinian Authority is not allowed at all to function in Jerusalem, and Israel has basically been eradicating Palestinian life in Jerusalem. I mean, obviously, it's always been a target since the 1967 complete occupation of East Jerusalem and things like this, but this has kind of picked up pace. So they've cut off suburbs of Jerusalem and put them outside the segregation wall. They've closed down Palestinian civil society organizations. They've increased settlements in what remains of Palestinian East Jerusalem. There's an epidemic of home demolitions, like all of these issues facing Palestinians within East Jerusalem, and they're not allowed to be represented by the Palestinian Authority. They're not allowed to engage with Palestinian Authority institutions, and so they're really quite in their own bubble, facing some of these challenges separately. So I'm sure your listeners have seen some of the maps, that are referred to like a Swiss cheese. So there's no territorial contiguity between any of these places. The other thing that was signed alongside the Oslo Accords was the Protocol on Economic Relations, which basically made the Palestinian economy subservient to Israel's. So anything coming in and out has to be approved by Israel. The Palestinians use Israeli currency. Israel collects taxes on Palestinian imports. It's supposed to give it back to the Palestinian Authority, but often withholds it for political purposes. And even though those taxes are a major source of Palestinian Authority revenue. So economic conditions in these territories are also quite bad. In Gaza, after the 2006 elections, which were free and fair by all election monitoring standards, the international community intervened and pressured the Palestinian Authority to launch a coup. And as has been mentioned already, it's been kind of under a different governing apparatus under Hamas. And the Israelis have full control of Gaza, what goes in and out. And economic conditions are really dire in Gaza. So they've reached almost 50% unemployment. There's rising suicide rates and just very dire conditions. So the conduit between Gazans and the rest of the world are third-party mediators such as the Qataris, who coordinate with the Israeli military institution in charge of the Gaza Strip, the coordinator of government activities in the territories. So under all three kind of living conditions, Palestinians are completely disenfranchised. Their leaders have either stayed past their term limits, or in the case of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, they're completely unrepresented, and many face imminent transfer. So I have more to say regarding kind of the conditions of Palestinian civil society and things like that, but I can leave that for the next question.
Yeah, so that's actually my next question. That was terrific. I want to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to stay with you for a moment, Dana. So you've written a lot about civil society. Obviously, this is something that we talk about in the United States a lot. It's a basic element of healthy democracy, right? Some have argued, I think you have argued, that the Oslo process has actually undermined, hampered what was once a vibrant civil society in Palestine. Can you talk about the state of civil society today in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and really how it has changed or evolved over the years, from before the Oslo process to today? You don't have to do it every single year, but tracking the trajectory.
Yeah, sure. Like you mentioned, I have definitely argued in in my book and some of my writings, that the Oslo Accords has had kind of a unique impact on Palestinian civil society and how Palestinians mobilize and organize amongst themselves, and social cohesion in Palestinian society generally. And that happened in two ways. So first, the Oslo Accord allowed for this kind of unprecedented geographic fragmentation between Palestinians in the territories. So there are these physical barriers to their ability to coordinate with each other. So whether it's the wall, the checkpoints, things are much tighter, and freedom of movement is much worse for people on the ground. So Palestinian territories have also been cut off from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was historically a center for political organizing. So many of the leaders of the First Intifada under the unified national leadership of the uprising were in Jerusalem, and they were working from Jerusalem. So in the years since Oslo, the Israelis have completely closed the city off to most of even its own inhabitants in the suburbs, as well as Palestinians in the remainder of the territories. So they've done that. They've also attacked civil society organizations within the city. They've closed down things like, even things we would consider innocuous, like the Palestinian Theater, the Palestinian Chamber of Commerce. Palestinians don't, have the kinds of spaces that they used to use to organize around their issues and demands. So the geographic fragmentation also basically meant like variation in lived experience. So everyone kind of deals with the occupation, but they're dealing with it in a piecemeal way. So for example, if there's a village dealing with land theft as a result of the separation wall, they'll organize around that. And then there's a village dealing with home demolition, they're organizing around that. And maybe there's a political assassination we sometimes see in certain cities, or arrest campaigns. So people will try to organize or address that. So it's like the Oslo Accords and the Israeli occupation has made it difficult to address the structural reasons for what's happening, that elephant in the room. And instead, everyone is kind of putting out small fires. Sorry for the confusion of analogies there, but that's essentially what it's like. And another way Oslo Accords have impacted Palestinian civil society is that through the creation of the Palestinian Authority and making the Palestinian Authority, dependent on foreign aid and external support, and by at its onset being quite an exclusionary institution, as Manal Jamal's new book Promoting Democracy looks at specifically, all of this has made the Palestinian Authority less accountable to its public. So the Palestinian Authority has become increasingly repressive, unaccountable, and it's impacted Palestinian social cohesion in ways we haven't seen before. So for example, the Palestinian Authority is a major employer. There's a segment of society that is dependent on the Palestinian Authority's continued existence and longevity. And then there's other segments of society that see, the status quo is untenable. They want major shifts to the Oslo, framework. So the Oslo Accords have really fragmented Palestinians politically, and Sam, alluded to this when he talked about the different viewpoints of differing worldviews between different political parties. And this sort of fragmentation and polarization has made it difficult for Palestinians to address shared concerns as they once were able to do. We saw in the first uprising, for example, Palestinian political parties of many different persuasions were included in the unified national leadership of the uprising. Today, we don't see that same level of coordination across political lines. And we actually see this in how people protest as well. So historically, in the first and second Palestinian uprisings, the cities were where the bulk of protests happened. Naturally, that's where institutions are, that's where the majority of people live. There's like this critical mass that can be harnessed, but today that's not really the case. The protests are happening really at the margins. So in my own research, I looked at just protest patterns, how much protest and political mobilization was happening from 2007 after the 2006 elections to 2016, and found that the vast majority, so 78% of political mobilization, were happening in areas B and C. So these much more sparsely populated, more rural areas are where the vast majority of political mobilization is happening. And these urban areas in Area A, where the vast majority of Palestinians live, are much more acquiescent. And this is not because conditions have improved for Palestinians in those areas. It's not because they don't have something to protest about necessarily, because we know that Israeli incursions happen in Area A as well, and people still suffer from repression and lack of freedom of movement and all of the conditions that other Palestinians face. But the role of the Palestinian Authority in repressing dissent in these areas, polarizing society, shows up in how people are mobilizing. So mobilization patterns shows this fragmentation very clearly. And Palestinian civil society in the West Bank particularly has become much less grassroots. So many organizations have, after the Oslo Accords, have kind of taken on like attempts to professionalize. So there's this concept that researchers like Dana have discussed called NGOization of these groups. So their objectives have narrowed. They look at issues much less holistically. They don't work with other groups as was once common, and they're more concerned with getting, international grants and funding to continue their work rather than kind of focusing on the immediate needs of the Palestinian people. Now, Gaza is a different beast. The Hamas government is quite repressive, we've seen in Gaza, and because it's under siege, it also doesn't tolerate dissent very well. So civil society has struggled there as well. And they have the added issue of being quite resource poor. So even in comparison to the West Bank, so because economic conditions are so dire internally and they can't engage internationally, the civil society has quite, become quite eroded in Gaza as well. Sorry if I spoke too much.
No, not at all. Thank you. Thank you for that, Dana. It was actually, I think you answered, in addition to the questions that we asked, you answered a question that I think has been on a lot of people's minds that we didn't ask, which is, why haven't we seen a third intifada, or why haven't we seen a Palestinian spring, like what we saw in neighboring Arab countries? And so I think your analysis is really very helpful in that regard. Sam, I want to turn to you to sort of drill down a little bit deeper in terms of Palestinian politics. Oslo obviously radically transformed Palestinian-Israeli relations. It transformed Palestinian governance, but it also fundamentally transformed Palestinian politics, if only because the PLO went from the outside to now being inside, where among other things, the Israelis had direct access to it, to Palestinian politics in ways that didn't exist before, for example, when the PLO was in Tunis or elsewhere. So, last week we saw this kind of play out in practice, right? We saw this where the Israelis revoked the VIP card of the Palestinian foreign minister, Riyad al-Malki. We also read about reports about Israeli intelligence meeting with President Abbas, trying to dissuade him from pursuing any kind of arrangement with Hamas, in terms of Hamas's participation in upcoming elections. We know that Israel has arrested a number of candidates or potential candidates, as well as parliamentarians, including Khalida Jarrar. So what does it mean for Palestinian politics to operate in this environment of Israeli control, and where the Israelis can easily intervene in ways that directly affect how the kind of dysfunction of Palestinian politics? And it kind of raises this question of, can you even have sound governance or even functional politics in this environment that you don't fully control?
Thank you. I actually want to link my answer to what Dana so properly described, which is the overwhelming aspect of the occupation on our society. We are in a laboratory kind of environment, and the Israeli occupiers know exactly the amount of resources and where we are and how we operate to the nth degree for their intelligence efforts as well as their collaborators' efforts. They have a mapping of what we have as capacity, which is probably better than what the Palestinians themselves have. So they're able to overwhelm us, as Dana said, on all kinds of issues, differing issues in differing cities on differing days. And no one really has the capacity to mobilize on a national level. And that's devastating in the bigger sense. In terms of your question, Khalid, I mean, no one here was surprised to hear that the VIP status of a Palestinian minister was revoked. Remember, we are living in a reality that Israel also imprisons, like you mentioned, legislative council members and arrests people who want to run for elections. They did that last time and they're doing it again this time. So no one has immunity in the eyes of the military occupier. I should make a side note here that the Israeli restrictions on our movement also applies to Palestinians Americans. I mean, such as myself. I'm an Ohio-born American citizen. I'm not permitted to enter the state of Israel, nor can I use the Israeli airport. Although any American Jewish person can roam Israel and even take up residence in the occupied territory, let alone become a citizen of the state of Israel freely. So Israeli restrictions are not hidden behind some kind of cloak of oppression. It is out there in your face, and all you need to do is open your eyes to see it. I note that because I understand this week there's a discussion that started for Israel to enter the USA visa waiver program, which is, to be honest with you, embarrassing to even talk about, given they have these kinds of discriminations that happen on different kinds of American citizens, be it an Arab American or a Jewish American, for example. The ICC is a different issue. It is worrying Israel, rightfully so. I assume most criminals in the world try to hide from the rule of law, but I mean, ultimately justice will be served. And it is up to the international community in this case not to punish those responsible for serving justice against the war criminals. Because that's what, for example, the US has put itself in a posture, especially during the Trump administration, yet to be seen how the Biden administration will fully play out on this case. But ultimately, you're holding the people who are responsible for investigating to see if it's true or not, as a starting point, responsible, instead of encouraging that investigation to move forward to find out, is somebody guilty of a war crime? And if so, I would expect Americans to support justice to be served on whoever is a war criminal, whoever it may be. As for the threats from the Israeli security officials, speaking on behalf of Israel, of course, they don't speak about the security environment, they speak representing the state of Israel, the military occupier. And they've made it clear to the Abbas administration not to hold elections. And if to hold elections, not to give any kind of cover to Hamas to be integrated into a political system. This is a clear indication that Palestinian division is serving our occupiers' desires. I mean, the beneficiary of Palestinian division is Israel, sitting there and using this internal conflict in the Palestinian community as an excuse, as if they needed one, not to engage the Palestinians. Of course, they ignore the fact that we have internal politics like everyone else, and any international party, Israel and the US included, who wants to do business with the Palestinians has always, and still does today, have an address. It's the state of Palestine sitting in the UN. So if anybody has a problem finding that address, they just need to email me and I'll direct them to the right place. But ultimately, when Palestinian political parties start to speak in one voice and are united in one institutional framework, the pressure on Israel to remove the boot of occupation off of our necks becomes much more higher. Palestinian governance in general under Israeli occupation can never be pristine. But that does not mean we do not have the means to have broader representation. Note the difference between US-style elections and what I call for, which is broader representation and collective decision-making. Remember here, for decades, we operated underground in a collective fashion. So we may need to take a few pages from our history to be able to deal with today's challenges. If we are able to have elections in any area, we should have them because that's the ultimate way to bring about representation. But if an area, for whatever reasons, is not able to have proper elections, then we need to rely on civil society and get a little bit creative on how we increase Palestinian representation. But we should never allow our occupier to define if we should move forward with better representation or not. And I have a feeling that that's what's being challenged today.
Thanks, Sam. Omar, I want to come back to you. I saw you had an intervention. I want to give you a chance to respond to what Dana said. But I also want to ask you to talk about, I mean, this goes really to what Sam was saying about sort of the occupier or the outside world defining for Palestinians what their positions have to be, what they're allowed to talk about. One of the key issues that comes up over and over, and I think there is a poor understanding of this issue and how it plays amongst Palestinians when it comes to Washington. That is the question of Palestinian prisoners. I think obviously in 2018, there was legislation passed, the Taylor Force Act, based on this argument that the US doesn't want any taxpayer money to go to anything that directly benefits the PA, so long as the PA or PLO are providing social welfare payments to prisoners or families of prisoners or people who've been killed by Israel. It's called the so-called Prisoner and Martyr Fund. This has then been this also been taken up in the international community and in Israel. It was called the pay to slay thing, right? So you give it a rhyming name, it becomes, something that is obviously universally accepted as a very simple fact. Palestinians, according to this argument, Palestinians engage in acts of terror against Israel solely because they are going to get funding for it. There's no other reason, and if you stop that funding, they would stop ever attacking Israelis. So I want you to talk about the issue of prisoners and the issue of this funding and how it plays, because I think looking at this as we go into potentially another round of elections, this is one of those issues which has been set up where it's a win-win for people who want to undermine, Palestinian governance, and it's a lose-lose for Palestinians. And I want you to sort of lay out the sensitivities and some of the context that people need to understand, but also first respond to whatever you wanted to respond to that Dana said.
Sure. Well, first of all, you're the foremost expert I know on, congressional legislation directed at Israel, Palestine, and on Taylor Force Act. So you could really, you alluded in your comments, you could discuss this issue, I think, better than anybody. I'll do so from the Palestinian perspective, as you asked. Regarding my intervention that I wanted to make on Dana's comments, which were really excellent and thorough. I just wanted to say, because she was talking about how the difference between activism and mobilization in areas A versus B and C. And when I was working there as a journalist years ago, more than a decade ago, I witnessed a lot of that myself, both activism in areas A and areas in B and C. And of course, and she mentioned that in areas B and C, excuse me, you butt up against the friction with the occupation is much more real and present and daily. So that activism is around settlement building and expansion. It's around land confiscation, and it's very localized. So you'll have like individual villages, organizing amongst themselves to protest and protest nonviolently against that particular settlement that's encroaching on their land. And what you started to have was a lot of these activists coming out of the cities, Palestinians and Israelis coming from Tel Aviv and from other places into these local villages to protest. But when it started to get bigger, first of all, the Israelis are dealing with it and almost training their soldiers how to deal with protests and nonviolent protests in these very localized movements. But when the Palestinian Authority starts to realize that mobilization is happening around that, it actually acts counterintuitively. You would think it almost would encourage going up against the occupation, but instead it fears broader mobilization of the Palestinian public, and it reacts to crush that so it doesn't get outside of its control. And that's kind of what was happening, and I witnessed it. Also, to Khalid's comment about there not being a Palestinian Arab Spring, there was at the time, and I witnessed it firsthand myself. It was an incipient movement of activists, especially young people. But their demands were limited. It wasn't overthrowing the Palestinian Authority, because Palestinians deal with something which is very difficult. They don't just have a regime like Egypt has a regime or like Libya has a regime. They have a regime under occupation. And so this creates a sort of confusion. They don't know what to do. You can't just throw over your leadership because there's also this layer of foreign control above you. So it creates a dissonance there. And the PA basically it accepted their limited demands and then co-opted and crushed the activists as they went. So I just wanted to add that. When it comes to the Taylor Force Act, I think this type of legislation, as you mentioned, is one way in which U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians regarding the Palestinians is essentially hamstrung by Congress. So the executive is very limited in the way they can act on any of these issues. It fits into that, and it really affects our ability as Americans to approach this conflict constructively and effectively, and that's a problem. It also shows, obviously, a fundamental lack of understanding of Palestinian society, which is not surprising. But you both have to understand, I think, the prisoner issue within Palestinian society, and you have to understand the nature of Israel's military justice system in the occupied territory. And this is significant for Palestinians because, as you said, it's defined in America as pay to slay, right? Whereas it insinuates that the authorities incentivizing Palestinians to go out and commit acts against Israelis, and it's going to pay them for that, and that's why. But that's really misleading, and that's a major form of incitement, I think, against Palestinians. First of all, that it's not a monetary incentive, and if there's a huge disincentive, in fact, not just in the risk to the livelihood of how Palestinians act, and it's not just acts of violence, it's just being political, right? If I'm a member of Fatah, for example, which is the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, the party of Abbas, that's illegal, defined illegally under Israel's occupation, and I can be plucked from my home and put in prison for that under Israel's military rules. So that's very misleading. I think in fact, the Palestinian Authority government under Mahmoud Abbas goes above and beyond to enforce security on Israel's behalf. Okay, so if anything, it's acting even to the detriment of its own standing amongst its public, who suffer daily from insecurity at the hands of the Israeli military and from settler violence. So to assert that they're encouraging their public to attack Israelis while at the same time enforcing security against their own public on behalf of Israelis is absurd. So that's another thing. Now, when we look at the Israeli military justice system, you have to understand that there's a 99% conviction rate of Palestinians. And it's not like Israel's being selective of who it takes in that regard. It's not like a prosecutor in New York, which is like, I can't win that case, I'm not gonna take this person to trial. It's 99% because whatever they say goes, and the judge essentially accepts it. And so the prisoner issue has touched the lives of every Palestinian. Adamir, which is a prisoners' rights agency, I think has like 700 or 800,000 Palestinians have been through the justice system. And this is a population of what is today a few million people. And so everybody, it's like, I don't know how many people are listening to this chat, but if you can think of 75% of us have either been through the prison ourselves, Israeli prison system, have a close family member through it. And so we all understand prisoners in much different way than we as Americans understand prisoners. We understand prisoners to be criminals. Within Palestinian society, it's not perceived that way because there are so many political prisoners. And obviously, there are people resisting occupation, but there's also just, political activism, which is treated differently. And we also have to look at the way Israel defines terrorism, which is very different than the way other societies, everything essentially fits under the rubric of terrorism within Israel. So just to say that person was convicted of terrorism and is in Israeli prisons, and the Palestinian Authority is giving them funding is a complete, is misconstruing what's happening here. And there's also a huge double standard because, I actually want to mention one more thing on this issue. Israel's prisons, I mean, this is never mentioned, operates essentially a canteen system, right? Where Palestinian prisoners need to buy all their essential items within prison. And this is never discussed. So basically, Israel doesn't have to pay for these Palestinian prisoners, which it incarcerates at a 99% rate. It requires the prisoners to essentially pay for themselves. And so in order to prevent undue hardship on those prisoners, which can be arrested for anything, and on those prisoners' families, the Palestinian Authority offers them financial contributions to help as a sort of welfare, right? So we have to understand it in that context as well. And again, like all things related to this conflict, there's a huge double standard placed on this. And again, it's about political spin. It's about driving wedges between the United States and the Palestinians to effectively cut off, funding, as you said, and to harness and to restrict the ability of the United States Congress to operate and for the executive to operate vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But Israel, pays its soldiers. It gives, and even there are NGOs. There's an NGO which gives money to Israelis that have been convicted of violence against Palestinians. And Yigal Amir, who assassinated the Israeli prime minister, receives some funding from that. And it's tax exempt in Israel and in the United States. So it's very complex and convoluted. And it's part of this, basically cudgel to redefine the Palestinians and to prevent constructive engagement with them. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Omar. That's very, very thorough. So, Sam, I want to come back to you. You talked about elections. You mentioned elections, and after 15 years of no elections, President Abbas has now called for the first elections to be held since 2006. The elections are going to be held in 3 phases. First, for the Palestinian Legislative Council on May 22nd, followed by presidential elections on July 31st. And then the third round will be elections for the PLO's more or less dormant parliament in exile, the Palestine National Council, set for August 31st. While many people see these elections as an opportunity to revive Palestinian political life, others see them as a means of entrenching a kind of dysfunctional status quo and even political stagnation. All 3 of you have written about the problems and opportunities presented by these elections. And so we want to do a kind of a deep dive. And if I can ask you to be as brief as you can so we can get through as many questions as possible. Sam, let's start with you. Right now, we're hearing reports that something like 95% of Palestinians have been registered to vote. At the same time, lots of people are skeptical that elections will even happen. So give us a sense of the temperature reading there on the ground in terms of how enthusiastic or not enthusiastic people are about elections. And if you could tell us also about kind of the technical side, why does the sequence matter? Why was it put in the sequence of PLC elections followed by presidential, followed by the PLO?
Sure. Actually, the number of registered voters this time around has been logged at 93.36. Amazing. Looking at that number in isolation of anything else, you would say that the entire Palestinian public is just, standing at the ballot box waiting for things to start. Where reality is, like myself, most of these people were registered a long time ago. I registered back in 2006 for the first election, and for municipal elections that have been happening ever since. So it was not that 93% of the population stood up and said, "Yay, we have elections, let's go register." Actually, we only have about 400,000 people who are new registrants this time around. And I think putting that in context is important, because some in our community, like the president's office, is using that number to show that people have a high vote of confidence for his move towards elections. I am from the school of thought that believes that the way in these elections were called for is entrenching a dysfunctional status quo. And this is from someone who has been calling for elections and writing about it. Again, more precisely, not about elections per se, but as I noted before, upgrading Palestinian representation and collective decision-making for years, including publishing 2 open letters to President Abbas. I have not hidden my intention that it is far too long that we have not had a better representation in the Palestinian political system. But that doesn't mean I'll accept any kind of process, because if it's a rigged process, the result will be rigged as well. Preceding the decrees that Abbas called for in these elections, he actually issued several other presidential decrees. And by the way, all of these decrees are holding the weight of law, because our legislative council has not been operating for the last 15 years. So our legislative council is basically one person signing a decree, and that's the president. And he did issue several other decrees before announcing elections, which damaged the integrity of our judiciary system. Our politics are broke. We're in a mess. We have a judiciary system that was kind of seen as the integrity that can hold us forward, carry us forward. And the President Abbas actually did a very heavy damage to the judiciary system with a few decrees on restructuring it and making him the person who appoints various parties within the judiciary system. I actually wrote that I think that's Abbas trying to do a Trump on the Palestinian people, but that's a discussion for a different day. This is not being accepted. and it's being pushed back by all of the constituencies that I can see of in the community. On the issue of sequence, the current decree calls for, as you noted, legislative council elections under occupation, and then a president, and even that is not clear. President of what? President of the State of Palestine or President of the Palestinian Authority? There's a little bit of ambiguity there. And then supposedly in August, we reached the supreme body of the PLO's Palestinian National Council. That actually turns the governing priorities on its head, because the supreme body, the ultimate legislative body in the Palestinian polity, is the PLO's Palestinian National Council, Congress. And that's the legislative body that should have been started with, because based on what that body decides, we may or may not have a Palestinian Authority. The mandate of the Palestinian Authority may be completely changed. More importantly, that body is the body to define the strategy of the national liberation movement. What tools are we going to use? How are we going to liberate Palestine? Because to me, Palestine exists. There's an occupation in it, and we need to remove the occupation. Some people in our community are calling for violence to be used. Others, such as myself, say we're more effective using nonviolence. It's important to know what the PLO says as it's reformed, because if they make a decision that is not to my liking, I may not want to run in Ramallah for a Palestinian Legislative Council seat. Why? Because anybody who wins the Legislative Council elections that are going to happen first in May here under occupation automatically becomes a member of the PNC, including myself or anybody from Hamas who wins, or any Israeli collaborator in our community, and there are many, who decides he wants to run in his community for a legislative council position and wins. All of a sudden, that person is now sitting in the supreme body of the PLO deciding our strategy. So there's something wrong with starting with the least impactful policy entity and leaving the most strategic policy entity to the end of the process. And a lot of people wonder, will we ever get to that process, depending on what happens in the first two rounds of elections? As it stands, PLC members in the West Bank and Gaza Strip will automatically become PNC members without embracing, and this is the important part, without explicitly embracing the PLO's mandate. The PLO has a charter, it has a mandate, it has institutions that are not necessarily being asked to be respected. All you need to do is to become a legislative council member in the occupied territory, and pop, you're into that organization. I think it's more constructive if the organization would open its doors properly for people who want to register a political party and accept the PLO's institutional framework, and then enter the body and try to change whatever it wants to change within it. There is a silver lining in all of this call for elections, and that is that it reveals yet again, for anyone who's been asleep at the wheel, that Israel blocks our democratic growth. It punishes and arbitrarily arrests candidates that it does not want to see elected, and it strips us from our ability for free movement throughout the occupied territory, not just in Jerusalem, but throughout the occupied territory. Let me give you a very quick example. If I decide to run from Ramallah, Israel prohibits my ability to campaign amongst 40% of the Palestinian population under occupation, which sits in the Gaza Strip. So I'm not even able to have a candidacy that can talk to my population and get votes, because Israel is blocking my ability to do that. Our internal Palestinian politics are just that. They are internal to Palestinians. And the international community, especially the US, instead of worrying about our internal politics, God knows they have enough of their own, needs to act to end this 53-year-old military occupation. So our exercise of democracy can be more organic and not be abused by someone holding military power above our head. Lastly, if the Biden administration does not reinstate the classification of this reality that we're living in as a military occupation, because Trump reversed that, if it does not correct Trump's acts, such as on Jerusalem or legalizing the settlement building, then nothing positive will be able to be expected from this administration. Worse yet, it may actually be creating the conditions for a second Trump presidency or Trump-like presidency.
So thank you, Sam. So you've laid out a lot. I think a lot of the rest of the conversation will be sort of almost responses to that. So Omar, you've written about elections. You've written that however flawed elections are still an opportunity, potentially to unify and reinvigorate Palestinian politics, for example, by bringing into the arena new voices and a new generation. We have two members of that on this panel that has too long been marginalized. Can you lay that out for us, the significance, the opportunity that you see here?
I was on mute. Okay, there's not a lot of time here, so I'll really make this brief. And again, I've written those 2 articles. You guys have been kind enough to put them there.
We can run a little bit over if we need to, so don't stress too much.
I've argued with Sam on this issue in private, and I've argued in public with Dana on this issue, so I'll leave it there. People can go read it. I'll say that, by the way, 400,000 new voter registrations among a voting population of like 2.5 or 2.8 million is actually pretty significant, I would say, of new voters. That's something that people that didn't vote in the past. So that's pretty significant. Anyway, I could respond to Sam all day on this. Actually, I usually agree with Sam on a lot of stuff. I disagree with him on a lot of the points that are being made. For one, the status quo is already entrenched, further entrenching. I don't see how it entrenches that much more in a significant way to forsake the opportunity to unentrench the situation through elections, even no matter how limited and potentially rigged they are. If Abu Mazen and Hamas are elected to their fiefdoms again, what changes? But if you can bring in new people, restart the PLC, which has been inoperable since 2007 and disbanded since 2018, why not do that? If you can bring people into the PLO, even if they haven't accepted the charter, although what's in the charter now after 22 years of having not met, that's still relevant because you want to reform that charter anyway. I mean, here's one way of doing it. But my biggest thing, and it's not about voices, it's not about all this kind of stuff. It's essentially that Palestinians have obstructionist leaders, authoritarian leaders that are undermining the civil society and the political system every single day. And how do you get out of that? How do you propose Palestinians? You said Palestinians need new leaders. How do you get new leaders? I mean, what's the process? What's the implementation process? Unless you're going to foment revolt or coup d'etat, there's only one way, and that's an election. Okay, that's one way. How are you going to get PLO reform? The people in power who are governing the PLO refuse to reform the system. How are you going to reform it? You can either start a new entity like the PLO, which challenges the PLO, or you can kind of try to get people together outside of Abu Mazen, but then you're running the risk of legitimacy and how you're going to do that and who really speaks for the PLO. Or you try to dislodge these people through one avenue or another. And that's the only way. And so it's really about, to me, it's about there are authoritarians in power, there are obstructionists in power. What are the means of dislodging those people, or at least loosening their grip so that Palestinian civil society, Palestinian politics can function again? Because they're completely stagnant, completely dysfunctional. There needs to be a mechanism for reinvigorating that. And I accept what Sam wants. I accept what Dana wants because I know what she wants. She's written about it. And all these other intellectuals and scholars and thinkers and activists, they all have the right idea, but I don't see from them a real engagement with implementation. How do you get there? And I'll leave it
there. Thanks, Omar. Dana, you took a different view from Omar's in your writing. You've argued that elections alone are not enough to fix the structural problems like Palestinian division, decaying national institutions, declining legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership. So tell us why you think these elections won't actually be useful, and what you think would be a better alternative way to basically respond to Omar's question of how else would you reform the current political sort of dysfunction. And if I could tack on a question, because another question, because we're running out of time. So I think this round will be sort of everyone's last chance to weigh in. After telling us what you think the alternative should be, give us a sense of what you think the international community should be doing to support Palestinian reforms and not help entrench these dysfunctional authoritarian systems.
Yeah, sorry, I was just checking if I was muted. Yeah, so I think Sam was quite thorough in explaining some of these things, but just to kind of weigh in, I think elections are often used, particularly by Americans, as some sort of magic pill, because people think elections equals democracy. And you know, we saw this in the democracy promotion kind of wave that happened during the George W. Bush era, and we continue to see this kind of discourse. But this is not only untrue, especially if you consider some of the structural shifts that have happened in Palestinian politics since the last elections, free elections in 2006. But I also think it's a dangerous distraction. The Palestinian Authority since 2006 has been helped by the international community to more effectively repress Palestinian opposition. There's even research to show how they've gotten involved at the local and municipal levels to make sure, you know, unfriendly people to the PA are not elected, to kind of get involved even at that kind of you know, micro level. So they've really tilted the playing field. And whatever comes of these elections that are supposed to happen, you know, I wouldn't consider them fair. And I think a large segment of the Palestinian population doesn't consider them fair. And even though Hamas and Fatah and you know, other minor parties, I think it's like 12 other parties, have agreed to respect the result of the elections, we don't actually have guarantees from the international community or the Biden administration that they would respect the results. And this is crucial because what we saw, you know, what happened in 2006, where elections did happen, they were free and fair, the international community didn't accept results, and we had such a fracturing of Palestinian society that we are still struggling with the polarization and division that moment engendered to this day. Salem Barahme, the executive director of the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, wrote in The Guardian that many consider the upcoming elections as a rubber stamp for power sharing between the two ruling parties, with which they can solidify the gains they made from the last parliamentary elections in 2006. And he goes on to say in that article that despite real hunger among young Palestinians to participate in the democratic process, recent PA changes to electoral laws have made it virtually impossible to compete and break the monopoly of the ruling factions in the West Bank and Gaza. So there's this situation where these elections can, you know, will not achieve anything except perhaps increase the level of frustration and apathy that, you know, young Palestinians feel, their disengagement, their inability to feel like they can change and seize their, you know, their agency to change the system. And on top of that, Palestinians in Jerusalem are banned from voting. So a large segment of the Palestinian people in the territories won't even be able to take part. So what does this mean? It means Palestinians will spend time bickering over these elections, which are meant to do what? Govern, you know, the West Bank and Gaza in the few remaining areas that supposedly the PA should have control over. These elections don't address the polarization in Palestinian society, the underlying issues between the political factions, even though they have, you know, said that they will respect results, but that there's other issues between them that they need to resolve first. These elections might even lead to violence if they don't go the way that, you know, the international community wants. We have no guarantees that the Israelis will respect the results. The international community will respect the results. So basically, I argue that these dynamics are not erased by simply holding a vote. And in fact, elections in fragmented authoritarian contexts only serves to exacerbate grievances between people and co-opt possible opposition that are willing to engage in the election, electoral process and provide a cover of legitimacy for Palestinian leadership that has long lost its mandate to govern. And importantly, these elections perpetuate the idea of the status quo of the Palestinian Authority as the institution to be, kind of at the helm of the, Palestinian cause. And that's not also true because the Palestinian Authority is not representative of a large segment of Palestinian society, those who live outside the territories. And the Palestinian Authority has been mentioned in this conversation, has sidelined the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, which is the Palestine Liberation Organization. And that organization is supposed to encompass Palestinians within and outside historic Palestine. So I have in the past, and other Palestinian policy experts and academics, particularly through Al-Shabaka, have been calling for reforms to instead address the Palestine Liberation Organization and to revive the PLO, using innovative ideas such as e-democracy initiatives to run elections for the PLO's internal institutions, particularly the National Council, the legislative body, and to finally reincorporate Palestinians wherever they may be so that they have a say in their future. And bring the crucial issues, particularly the right of return and the fate of Palestinians in Jerusalem, back to the peace process. And, kind of to sum up, essentially, elections kind of kick the ball down the road instead of addressing the root issues. And we are past the point where we can continue to wait, because the two-state solution is no longer viable and living conditions are the worst they've ever been, and the situation is incendiary. So to waste time on elections that won't be fair with all the PA's years of manipulation and repression, they won't be respected even if they go a different way, and that exclude from consideration many of the key issues at the heart of the Palestinian cause, it seems unreasonable to me and to many others living in Palestine. So I don't know if I have time to answer kind of the second part of your question about.
Yeah, we decided we're gonna take the executive decision to run over because we want to do the last round. So hold off on that and let's stick with the order as planned. And Omar, I know you wanted to weigh in. I'm hoping you can wait. We're gonna come back to you again. So everyone's gonna get one more shot if that's okay. So sticking to the order, and that was all of you, fantastic. There's so much to unpack here. Sam, we want to come back to you. In this round, we really want people to be sharp because we're really just trying to pack a lot in. We're not going to go past 1:30, just for the sake of all of you and for our audience. So Sam, last time that there were Palestinian elections, you've talked about them. I was an observer at those elections on the ground. Hamas, which is obviously been labeled an FTO, foreign terrorist organization by the US, and is considered a terrorist organization by Israel, it won, and it won free and fair. Those were the cleanest, those elections were so clean, the European observers I was with were sort of bored, like, why are we here? The result, of course, was a US and Israeli-led international boycott of the PA. With this as the context, a lot of people, including in Washington, are actively calling on Palestinian leaders to exclude Hamas from participation in the upcoming planned elections, or at least to promise to exclude them from any government that might come out of them. Assuming the PA doesn't agree to that, how likely do you think it is that Hamas will win, and what will be the impact of that? And if the PA were to agree to exclude Hamas, what would be the impact of that in terms of legitimacy of those elections? And I don't think we have time. I wanted to ask about how you think the U.S. government should respond, but I think I want to leave that for Dana to take on at the end.
Okay. I mean, I would say likewise, many Palestinians view the Proud Boys as domestic terrorists and do not view senators or congressmen who support them as worthy of office. But domestic politics are what it is. And like Americans don't want anyone interfering in their electoral process, neither do Palestinians accept foreign interference. So the discussion of who should or should not be included in our political system is really not one for the international community, and definitely not one for the US, who has taken sides on this issue, to weigh in on. They can weigh in on the results in terms of wanting to deal with the outcome or not deal with the outcome, but it's up to the Palestinians to decide who they want to represent them. In 2006, the result was a colossal mistake for the US, by the US and many European countries. They supported, as you said, free and fair elections, but couldn't swallow the results. Too bad we couldn't do that in the US, I guess. The EU has learned its lesson, it seems. At least I've been talking to a lot of foreign diplomats here from Europe, and they understand that they need to deal with the outcome at that point and not to deter Palestinians from having the right to vote into office whoever they think should be their representative. The US still sees itself as the policeman of the world, and that is unsustainable. If the US does not stop trying to pick and choose other countries' leaders, it's going to find itself talking to itself. And that's why the Biden administration has not only corrective measures that are required, but a US leadership role to regain, not only in Palestine, but in other areas as well, and maybe globally. And Palestine is a good place to articulate that leadership if there's political will to make it happen. Just like the world accepted Trump as the US president, the US must accept any chosen leader of other countries, Palestine included. If it is blocked by US laws, it's not the people who have to re-elect somebody else, it's the US laws that need to be changed. And Omar alluded to this as well. It's the US, stupidly, in my opinion, legislating itself in a corner that doesn't give the executive branch of government leeway to actually do its work in foreign affairs. Because the pro-Israeli lobby made this issue a domestic issue in the US scene. So it's no longer dealt with like a foreign affairs issue. And that's detrimental to US strategic direction. And that needs to be corrected. And that's why I said earlier, the issue is leadership at this point and nothing else. I'll stop there so others have time.
Thanks, Sam. Omar, I know you've been chomping at the bit, so we're gonna let you respond to make the point that you wanted to make. But in addition to that, I want to ask you this. So in addition to this Fatah Hamas rivalry going on, there's a lot of dysfunction going on within Mahmoud Abbas's own Fatah party, right? There's a lot of divisions. There's the old feud of Abbas and former Gaza security chief Mohammed Dahlan. But more recently, Abu Mazen seems to have picked a fight with Nasser al-Qudwa, who's a longtime Fatah member and former foreign minister, former PLO ambassador to the UN, all because he wanted to run his own list in these coming elections. And then, of course, there's the situation with Marwan Barghouti, who's probably the single most popular Palestinian politician out there, and he's currently serving 5 life sentences in an Israeli prison for his role during the Second Intifada. So there's clearly dissension within the ranks in Fatah. So talk to us about some of that, and what does that mean for moving forward with elections, and what does it tell us about possible scenarios for future succession, since Abbas, after all, is in his mid-80s?
You guys keep taking the wind out of the sails of my interventions, which if I didn't love and respect you guys so much, I would be angry at you, but I'm not. Anyway, I would say, I mean, my intervention was basically, again, I agree with everything that Dana was saying. I agree with her diagnosis. I agree with her prescription. But how do you get to the pharmacy? How do you get the medicine to administer to the patient? I still don't understand it. You can say the elections are not fair. I agree. But what happens if you're not going to get free and fair? What do you do then? There's the adage, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I acknowledge these odds aren't even good. But, the perfect is also the enemy of an opportunity where there's no other opportunities. And sometimes you have to seize what limited opportunity there is, because what's the alternative? I still haven't heard it from anybody else. What's the alternative? And with the legislation that's against Palestinians and is restricting what the executive can do there, it's not stupid. It's designed to do that. That's its intention. So what do you do about it? That's these are the things. I mean, it's not like we're stumbling into this kind of legislation. It's designed to restrict what the U.S. government can do vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Now, to get to the other question regarding what's happening within Fatah, yes. Fatah is unraveling. There are deep fissures there. A lot of it has to do, I mean, again, we talked about Fatah being, and the Palestinian political scene being dynamic. It once was, and Fatah was the most dynamic, the most open, and the largest Palestinian political faction. It was that. And even, people think of Yasser Arafat running Fatah, as this kind of iron hand and stuff like that. He really was like the convincer in chief. He really had to convince people to come along with him on this road or on that road, because he didn't have coercive power in the way, I mean, he did it at the end with the Palestinian Authority to a degree, but he was still, had his old way of big tent and bringing everybody in, whereas Abu Mazen is very small tent, very, very small tent, used the coercive power of the Palestinian Authority to crush the opposition. And even within the Fatah party, he has limited who can speak and who can make arguments and who can do what to an amount of decision makers that is this big. And what happens is, that's given him major control over the party, and you have all these other people within Fatah who were leaders within the movement. These aren't insignificant people who were main people within the movement who have been completely marginalized because they disagree with Abu Mazen. And Abu Mazen has gained tighter control over Fatah because of that, but because of the election, now it's starting to unravel, because that leadership style, that authoritarian leadership style, has marginalized everybody else. And so other people are now, using these elections as a catalyst to do that, and it's causing it to unravel. Nasser al-Qidwa is an interesting figure, but he's well known within the international community and within Palestine as itself, because he's the nephew of Yasser Arafat. You know, he was also, I think, foreign minister. He was ambassador to the UN for the Palestinians, but he's not a major player within Palestinian politics in terms of having a huge constituency of supporters on the ground. He's not. And that's why he's trying to maneuver and maybe attach himself to Marwan Barghouti, who, because of his political activism in the 80s, in the first Intifada, and as well as in the second Intifada, is considered a leader, even though he's been away from the scene essentially for 20 years. I mean, he still weighs in and still participates somewhat from prison, but the Israelis have kept him in isolation essentially for 20 years. And so the Palestinians, I don't even really understand who Marwan Barghouti is today to an extent. I mean, that might be an incendiary comment, but he's been kind of away from the political scene, unfortunately, to the Palestinians. But because of his activism and because the rest of the political slate of Palestinians is worthless essentially and has proved themselves worthless to their people, Marwan Barghouti still carries weight because, not that they're worthless, but Abu Mazen has crushed every other opposition, and he's only elevated people who are essentially mediocre around him so that nobody can use their position to gain popularity among the Palestinian public. And so anyway, there are fissures happening, and Nasser al-Qidwa has taken his own slate. Marwan Barghouti is going to contest Abu Mazen. And if that happens, if we get to the presidential election, and I agree with Sam in the fact that we may never get there. I mean, we might never get to a legislative election. That's a very big possibility because these guys fear a legislative election, even though they're rigging it as best they can, even though, like Salam Barahmeh wrote, you have to be now 28 or 29 to run, which is very high. You have to have $20,000 in the bank. They're putting every obstacle they can in the way of these elections, but still they fear the outcome because there's an opportunity there to an extent. I'll leave it there. I can get into all this stuff. I can speak it for an hour on this stuff. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Omar. And I'd expect that as we get closer to what may or may not be elections, we're going to have more conversations like this. There'll be many more opportunities. I look forward to that because this is really helpful. Dana, you're going to get the last word. And you're welcome to respond to anything that's been said. The question that we wanted to ask you earlier that I ask you now is how if the goal is legitimately to support Palestinian democracy and good, accountable, effective governance, what should the international community, including the US, be doing before, in the hopes that there might be elections that are good, and what should they be doing after, given what we saw happen with the 2006 elections?
Thanks. So let me start with your question and then, let me start with your question first. You know what, actually, let me just respond to Ahmad first, because I think that this question kind of ends the conversation. So I don't want to leave any kind of loose ends. So I didn't get into, the specific policy proposals given kind of the time constraints, but if people are interested, Al-Shabaka has done year-long policy proposal workshops in which we've put out, some ideas for how to, as you said, implement an alternative. So I would encourage you to go through that and read that more carefully. In terms of Lara's question, so I mean, for a start, if elections are to move forward, the U.S. obviously should not pressure the Palestinian Authority and should not, conduct itself the way that it conducted itself last time in sanctioning the Palestinians if elections don't go in the direction they want. And they should not allow for the Palestinian Authority's coercive apparatus to kind of get involved in the proceedings. But generally speaking, there's also new research to show that foreign aid allocated to local governance is much more useful than aid allocated to securitization or democracy promotion efforts, particularly in the case of Palestine. So there was a comparison between El Salvador and Palestine in Manal Jamad's new book, and she found that local governance was much more useful. So U.S. aid should be reoriented in that direction, ideally, and the international community with the U.S. at its helm should take a firm position with Israel and use their leverage with Israel in order to halt political repression of Palestinians and stop criminalizing Palestinians from engaging in legitimate nonviolent political activity, whatever their political persuasion. Because what we're finding is that, and we see this in polling, is that as people feel more, let's say, frustrated or like there aren't options for them to engage in the political process, whether it's student elections or whatever, the Israeli occupation represses all kinds of political activity, they become more supportive of violent methods. And this is polling that I've conducted. This is polling corroborated by the Palestinian Center for Research and Survey, for Survey and Policy Research. So it's out there, and this is something that we need to consider. And the international community, obviously, with the Americans, leading that drive, they need to consider what they are doing when they allow the Israeli occupation to conduct itself in the way that they are. Hopefully, I kept that brief enough.
Yes, thank you so much, Dana, and thank you all. So we're now out of time. So on behalf of the Middle East Institute and the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank our participants, Sam, Omar, and Dana, for a really rich, enlightening discussion. I know there's a lot more to be said, and hopefully this will be there will be more opportunities down the road. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this webinar and for this entire series. As we noted earlier, this is our last session. So just a reminder to everyone that you can find a recording of today's session as well as previous ones on the landing page for this event. We'll be sending around a link to those of you who've signed up right after the event. And thank you and farewell.
Thank you all so much for participating.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks all. Take care.